John Niehaus, Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors. I'd like to welcome you to this edition of the NAFI 10-Question Challenge. Today, my guest is Max Trescott. Max has been an instructor since 2001, roughly equating to 19 years of flight instruction. He's a CFI, II, MEI, ATP. He's a 4-time previous master instructor. He was CFI of the Year in 2008. He's written 2 books, Max Trescott's G1000, Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook. He's got another one on the way for the G3000. He's a Cirrus Platinum CSIP and specializes in Cirrus instruction along with the Vision Jet. He has been on a podcast called Aviation Geeks for 6 years. He's done his podcast, Aviation News Talk, for 3 years. And he also has a YouTube page under the same name. Max, welcome.
Great to be here, John. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you.
Likewise.
And in the traditional format, we'll just jump straight into it.
Okay.
Was flight instruction part of your original career plan, or was it something you never anticipated doing?
Boy, it was not part of my plan. I never anticipated it. When I was in college, I thought that there were 2 possible career options for me. One, I had worked at a number of different radio stations, including working directly for CBS at one point. And I was also very interested in high tech. And so when I got out of school with an engineering degree and a psychology degree, I had to choose, and I had started to fly when I was 15. So flying had always been part of my life, but I thought it would just be an avocation forever that I did for fun on the side. I decided not to go into broadcasting. I spent 25 years in high tech working for one of the largest computer companies here in the United States, first on the marketing side and then later in sales. And then after I left high tech, after about 25 years, I became full-time teaching. And I had started teaching about 3 years before I left. I'd been teaching on weekends a lot. So it was pretty easy to make that transition. I was really lucky. A friend of mine named Tim Johnson, who I think has subsequently moved to Florida. I think he sells real estate there now. But one summer he said to me, "Max, I'm getting my CFI. You should too." And I thought, yeah, you're right. I should do that. So I fell into it totally, serendipitously. And unfortunately, I already done my commercial, and so it was easy for me just to step into it. But no, never in my wildest imagination did I think I would become a CFI. And I often tell folks when I'm giving presentations, for example, that they should consider becoming CFIs, because I think there are many great potential CFIs out there lurking among the pilot population. Some of us, like me, don't realize that we could or should become CFIs. So I was grateful that Tim made that suggestion to me, and that's why I try to plant the seed with other people as well, too.
Sure. Now, was the CFI the catalyst for you to then leave the tech job, or what was the drive there?
That's a good question. I had started doing it on the side, and I always kind of knew I would have a second career, and that's because in high tech, it's hard to stay there forever. I would say that as people tend to reach their 50s, they tend to get pushed out of high tech or offered early retirement and things like that. I actually got laid off, and I was thrilled because at that point I was ready to do something else. And I started a business that was totally unrelated. And after about 2 months, I just hated it. And I thought, well, I do this CFI thing on the side. Maybe I should give that a go as a full-time business. And I've never been happier. I just absolutely love teaching.
So reflecting on your skill with your very first student, how well do you think you did?
You know, this is kind of interesting. I think I did reasonably well because I had been flying for 20 years already, and I had close to 1,000 hours under my belt when I was teaching my first student. And I'd also taught a ground school before I got my CFI. So I think I had a lot of the academic skills and a lot of just the raw knowledge that was required. That's not to say that there weren't some hiccups. On my very first flight with my very first student, we took off from Reed Hillview Airport, which is a towered airport in San Jose with parallel runways. And we made a left downwind departure. And apparently we were called multiple times by the tower as we were turning, but I was so busy talking that I was not keeping track of, as you know, as a CFI, the problem of, talking to your client, keeping track of what's going on the radio. And so as we were on downwind, I finally heard our aircraft being called and they said, "Is there a CFI on board?" And so at that point, I had missed so many calls. They thought maybe it was a student pilot. And of course, what I wanted to do was, tell my client, say no, say no. But of course, I fessed up and said, yes, sir, CFI on board here. And he said, hey, you got to listen up. You've been missing radio calls. So yeah, that was kind of a rocky first flight.
Well, you just got so invested in teaching that, the outside world wasn't as important.
Yeah, and I think I hadn't really fully learned the kind of the split brain skills that we need as flight instructors. You need to be keeping half an ear tuned to the radio while having the other ear tuned to your client, and it's a challenge. Pilots don't have to do that. So even though I had 20 years of flying, I hadn't run into that problem before.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So most of us have had an instructor mentor who have helped us along the way. Who was yours, and what was the most meaningful thing they taught you?
I don't really feel like I had a mentor per se, and maybe I, should have sought one out and, didn't, but there was certainly somebody who inspired me. And that was my very first flight instructor. I learned to fly at what was then called the Grand Canyon State Airport in northern Pennsylvania. It's kind of a rural part of Pennsylvania where I grew up. And Richard Johnson, or Dick Johnson, was the guy who did everything at the airport there. So he managed the airport for the state. He did charter. He gave flight instruction. He mowed the grass. You name it. He was, the one man at the airport. And I remember when he was awarded he was named as the Pennsylvania Flight Instructor of the Year at one point, and I was very impressed with that. And I think in some ways that may have inspired me. Many years later when I became a flight instructor, the one thing he said to me, which always stuck with me, and I was delighted that he said it. I had worked on my license as a teenager, and then I'd gone off to college, finished my training, and then I'd started my first job. And I was probably a year or two into that job. So I was in my early 20s. And I came back with him to fly, and we went flying. And he said, Max, you don't fly enough. And I thought, oh, okay. And I think that's when I kind of realized, there is a kind of a minimum baseline where you really do need to be out there, flying. You can't just kind of go, well, I passed my check ride and now I'm a pilot, and, if 6 months go by and I don't fly, no big deal. And there have been rare occasions where I have said that to other people as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what's the most valuable non-aviation skill you've learned as a flight instructor?
Yeah, so I think the thing that people say to me most often is, wow, you are really patient. And so that's something that I've learned over the years is incredibly important. And I think I'm probably a better flight instructor having started, probably in my early 40s, as opposed to, when many people start. Because if, I think back to who I was in my 20s and my 30s, and yeah, I wasn't nearly as patient, and I was probably, always in a hurry, always in a rush, a little bit of a perfectionist. And fortunately, time has taken the edge off of some of those things, which wouldn't have made me as good a flight instructor. So for me, it was probably lucky that I didn't come to flight instructor till I was in my 40s and had matured in a variety of different ways. But I think patience is probably one of the most important ones, because as a flight instructor, you're going to say more right rudder, 100 times to the same person over the course of teaching them the private. And I have found that by learning new things myself, such as most recently, when I think of big new things, getting a type rating in the Vision Jet 2 years ago, that really helps remind me of what the learning experience is like on the other side, which then makes me a little bit more patient, a little more sympathetic and encouraging as a flight instructor when I'm teaching other people who are learning something new for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, the old adage of a good instructor is always learning, but sort of taking it to that sort of next degree, which is if you stay in that student mindset, you always understand what they're going through.
So very important, because I think it's kind of easy sometimes to just think, what's wrong with this person? It's like, no, they're doing the best they can. You just have to keep encouraging them. I think that's probably another important skill, for flight instruction, and that is being both a cheerleader and a coach, kind of the chief inspiration officer of the company. People are there to do something that's fun, and you gotta keep it fun, especially teaching adults, but it's probably true with teenagers as well. So I'm constantly joking with people in the cockpit. I sometimes think that I'm up there entertaining myself in the process, but I think clients enjoy it, and I see them more relaxed as a result, and I think they learn more easily if we're up there having fun. Now, the flip side is you don't want to go too far in the opposite direction where there's just a lot of chatter and a lot of jokes back and forth and so on. So literally just a day or so ago, I was with somebody in the cockpit and I said, okay, let's cut it off right here. Let's focus on the serious business at hand. So there is a balance that you really need to strike.
Oh, 100%. I went to a collegiate 141 university, and it's very regimented and very strict in here's what you do, here's what you don't do.
Yeah.
And my first instruction job was Part 61, and I tried to go at it the same way that all of my instructors did, and what it took me a long time to remember or realize that the students that I had Part 61 were there for a very different reason than I was. And I don't want to say I scared anybody off, but I definitely didn't have that fun aspect for a little while because I just didn't understand that they were there to have fun. And yeah, it was a learning process for me. So what do you enjoy most about flight instruction then?
Probably two things. One, I really help my clients. I really enjoy helping my clients achieve their goals. So for me, helping other people, achieve major milestones is very satisfying. So for example, when somebody solos, I'm almost as excited as they are, when they solo. I know that's not quite possible, but I still love that moment and I always look forward to it. And it becomes very satisfying. I've just in the last week was flying with two different people for their instrument rating who I taught their privates. And I can't tell you how many times I grinned when I watched them land their Cirrus. And I just thought, oh man, those were great landings. And it's kind of fun to kind of think, yeah, and we did it together. I helped you, achieve this. The other thing that I really love a lot about flight instructing, and this is a little self-serving, I love the view. I just love watching the world go by. To me, I'm always up there just checking out, what's new and what's different. And I'm most at peace and most happy when I'm up watching the terrain go by. Here in California, we've got the ocean, we've got mountains. It's fun. There's just so much to see. And one of the things I discovered when I started teaching in the Vision Jet is that the view is a little different. I mean, you have these monster windows, and when you're down low, yes, you got a great view, but most of the time you're up there on top of the clouds, and that's just not quite as thrilling from a view standpoint. So that's why I really kind of enjoy a mixture of both. I like teaching in the jet because it's my favorite aircraft, but I still love being down low watching the world go by, which is why I'm going to always continue to teach in pistons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell me about a interesting, fun, or scary time you've had as an instructor with a student.
I've had people have often asked me, have students ever done anything to you that was really scary? They seem to think that, as flight instructors, we're, constantly being put in life-threatening positions. And oddly, I have never had a situation where someone's aviation skills, made me feel like we were in jeopardy or at risk. Now, granted, there are times where I've, saved them a lot of money by pulling back at the right time on the stick as they are about to bury the aircraft into the ground. But, that would have damaged the aircraft. That wasn't really life-threatening. The one time that I can look back and say, wow, this was a tough experience was I was flying with a gentleman who was a bit of a perfectionist. He always wanted to do everything perfectly, but he also had another issue, which was that he had an anger problem, and it was self-directed. So whenever he performed poorly, he would literally start yelling out in the cockpit at himself in very negative kinds of terms, and it was a little worrisome. I remember one night being out with him flying at night, and he was a private, so we must have been doing some instrument related work. And at one point he started doing this, and I thought, well, maybe I can lighten the mood here with a little humor. Boy, I was wrong. That just made it worse. And so the only thing I could do was just remain silent, because there was absolutely nothing I could say that would improve the situation. And I realized at that point that if this guy wanted to kill both of us, I might not be able to prevent him from doing that. I mean, I certainly thought about, where my elbow might go into his body if necessary, or I even thought about, gosh, if it really came to this, I think I know how to undo his seatbelt and undo his door, and we could probably go into a steep turn in his direction if I had to do that to save myself. Fortunately, it didn't come to that. But it wasn't fun realizing that, hey, someone's anger issues could have ended my life. And that was the last time I ever flew with that gentleman. So I think the key thing for flight instructors to know is that sometimes you have to fire the client. There have been very, very, very few times where I've had to fire a client, and I don't usually tell them that they're fired. I usually become unavailable or things like that. Yeah, I think that's an important thing to remember, is that you need to choose your clients wisely. The vast majority of the time, they are wonderful, but pilots are just like a cross section of the population. There are a few nuts out there, so you gotta do what you can to avoid them.
Well, and it further emphasizes that what a flight instructor does is more than just teach. I mean, you're analyzing personalities, you're making decisions, you're analyzing risk. Whoever thought you would need to be a therapist to be a flight instructor?
Well, that's the interesting thing, because I have degrees in electrical engineering and psychology.
Oh,
And I sometimes feel that the degree in psychology is the more important one when I'm out teaching.
yeah. So in your mind, what quality or skill makes for the best flight instructor?
Yeah, so I think probably the number one thing for flight instructors is to just put their client ahead of their own needs. You got to put your client needs first. I mean, I think that's what good salespeople are taught. When I was selling for a high tech company, we were always taught to, look at the customer's needs and try and fulfill them. And there are times as a flight instructor where I think sometimes flight instructors will think about their own needs first. Maybe their need is to build lots of time so that they can move on to the next job. And I think that's the wrong thing. I think that you have to be selfless. You have to always, basically put your client's needs ahead of yours. And there are going to be times when you will be in the position of, having to advocate on their behalf. So for example, the flight school might be looking, for one thing, the client's looking for something else. If there's some middle road that you can help negotiate, I think that's important as flight instructors. Always put your client first, always be their advocate. And I think that's probably going to serve you incredibly well. The other thing we've talked about before is just patience. I think as flight instructors, we need to be patient and, also have a bit of a sense of humor.
I absolutely agree. So for what you do now, how has flight instruction prepared you?
Well, so I'm still a flight instructor, but I do a number of things on the side. So, for example, when I think about the Aviation News Talk podcast, which is often ranked number one in the Apple Podcast app of the over 200 aviation podcast here in the U.S., being a flight instructor has really brought me a lot of stories that I can tell, a lot of background information, helps me understand what people are going through in their own flight training. So I'm able to address all of those issues when I'm talking with people on the podcast. Also, as an author, I chose to, act. I could have become a full-time author, but I didn't want that. I didn't want to be behind the computer all the time. So I've tried to strike a balance between staying in the airplane every week with all of my other activities, And so what I'm learning and experiencing in the cockpit feeds back both into the books that I'm writing, so that the books on glass cockpits, truly reflect kind of a pilot's perspective, as opposed to talking about, these are the knobs and what they do. Talk more from the perspective of, what is it pilots need to do and the different ways to best accomplish them, with the different controls and so on that you have. So Flight Instructor, I think, has really enriched what I'm doing, both on the podcast as well as the books that I write.
Now, on a piggyback to that question, how did you then leverage your previous time as an instructor and all the things you've done prior to the podcasts and all of that? How did you leverage that into what you do now?
So certainly I would say that flight instruction has been the core around almost what all my other activities, revolve around. So you can think of that as kind of the central activity and everything else is on the side. So I'm an author, I'm a speaker, I create YouTube videos. So all of that stuff kind of comes back from flight instruction, and what I learned flight instruction kind of feeds into and drives all of those other activities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you could give a new instructor a single piece of advice for success in the profession, what would it be?
Specialize. Yeah, I really believe in specializing. I think that if you are truly going to become an expert in your craft, whatever that is, in this case, we're talking about flight instruction, it really pays to specialize because I think, you go back years ago, people could be the jack of all trades. As a flight instructor, you could teach everything from, tail wheel to jets and do some crop dusting on the side. Yeah, maybe if you live in a small airport in a rural area where, you've got to take on every client who comes by because there just aren't that many. Yeah, maybe you might be the jack of all trades. But I think that, in the increasingly complex world that we live in here, it really pays to specialize. So when I first started teaching, for the first couple of years, I, taught in the older Cessnas and, Pipers we had in the flight school. But within a couple of years, I knew that I was very, very interested in the glass cockpits that had just come out. And part of that was, my background was electrical engineer. Yeah, to me, that just seemed more interesting. And then as I got into it, I realized that, wow, these systems are more powerful. They have far more safety features. And if you know how to use them really well, you can both make your flying easier, and safer. So I actually changed airports in about 2005. Instead of teaching at Reed Hillview, I moved up to Palo Alto because there were no glass cockpits for rent at Reed Hillview. And at Palo Alto, there were. And it was probably a year or so after that where I went back to the factory at Cessna, took the G1000 course, and that led me to write my first book. So specializing in glass cockpits really made people in the local area know that, hey, if you want to know something about glass cockpits, contact Max. And so that helped feed my business. And then over 3 years ago, I decided to specialize further, and I said, I love the Cirrus, and there's an even greater need for specialized teaching in the Cirrus because there are more little gotchas, more things that people need to know. And ironically, when I narrowed myself down to just teaching the Cirrus, I got busier. I had even more people coming to me to the point where I had to raise my rates, soon after that. So my experience has been specialization both benefits you as a CFI, it benefits the clients because now they're getting the best possible information. And I think it also helps people from, just kind of a, financial success standpoint as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Max, we've made it. We've gotten through the 10 questions.
Okay.
I was hoping to give you a little bit of time here. For somebody who doesn't know, tell us a little bit about the two podcasts that you have and the YouTube channel.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So Aviation News Talk is the podcast that I spend most of my time on, and it is focused strictly on general aviation. So there are a lot of aviation podcasts that, cover, the full breadth of topics. Once again, I'm specializing. I want people to know that when they come here, we're not going to be talking about the military, the airlines. We're just going to be talking about GA. Strong focus on safety, strong focus on technical skills. Basically, we go through the news at the beginning of the show and then drill down into a topic in depth. And the feedback I've gotten from people is that by going in depth like that, almost everybody feels that they've learned at least one or two new things in each of the shows, which I think is good. Even experienced pilots are coming back and going, "Yeah, I wasn't going to listen to that, but then I discovered, whoa, there was even more about this, that I didn't know." So I really do a deep dive on each of the topics, and then often I'm doing research and I'm learning things that I didn't know, myself. So that's beneficial. And then I'm also a co-host on the Airplane Geeks podcast. That's one of the longest running podcasts, about 11 years now. We're well up to 600 and some, episodes. That podcast does cover the full range of, aviation, and it's a little bit more focused on guests. We typically have a guest every week, whereas Aviation News Talk often is just me talking. And then for the YouTube channel, that's generally just a spin-off of things that I have done on the podcast. So for some of the topics, I'll just go ahead and add, video and photos and things like that to make it more interesting. So that's what I'm doing these days. So most of my time is at Aviation News Talk.
And I'm assuming they can get access to those podcasts on all the major formats.
Yep, wherever you get a podcast, or just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and you'll find all kinds of links to it there.
Any other projects or final thoughts you might have?
Boy, I think we've kind of covered the gamut here. I guess the final thought is, during these times of COVID, continue to practice the same kind of risk management you do when you teach and when you fly, with regard to COVID as well. So these days when I'm in the cockpit, I'm fully masked up. My clients are fully masked up. And just literally 2 days ago, I had an email that came through that one of the CFIs who teaches where I teach had a client who caught COVID, and the CFI removed himself from the schedule, as quarantining at home for a few days. So it's serious business, and I would just urge people to treat it the same way they treat any risk management issue when they're flying.
Mm-hmm. That's good advice. Very good advice. Max, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us.
John, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me here.